Have you ever felt that pressure? You know the one, that constant, kind of buzzing background noise of modern life telling you that you should be happy. That if you just tried a little harder or thought a little more positively or maybe downloaded the right mindfulness app, you could unlock this amazing higher state of well-being. It's an idea that's absolutely everywhere, right? From corporate wellness programs all the way up to government policy. But have you ever just stopped for a second and asked, where did this whole obsession even come from? How did our most private, most subjective feelings become this public, measurable thing, a commodity even? Okay, let's really dive into this because the story of how happiness got packaged up and sold to you is one of the most fascinating and maybe one of the most unsettling stories of our time.
So to kick this journey off, I want you to meet someone. This is Mathieu Ricard. He's a French molecular biologist who, back in his 20s, walked away from a super promising scientific career at the Pasteur Institute to become a Tibetan Buddhist monk. And for years, he's actually been the French translator for the Dalai Lama. But in the early 2000s, he got famous for something completely different. He became this unique test subject in a really groundbreaking study at the University of Wisconsin. It was a study that was trying to literally peer inside the meditating mind to find the neural signature of happiness itself. The researchers, they wired him up, attaching 256 sensors to his head for hours and hours. And what they found, well, let's just say it was about to change everything.
And this is it. This is the number it all comes down to, negative 0.45. See, in that Wisconsin study, the scientists had to create a scale to measure positive feelings, and it was a pretty unconventional scale. Deep misery was around positive 0.3, while the highest states of happiness actually went into the negatives. Now, the highest score they had ever recorded before this was negative 0.3. Mathieu Ricard's brain, deep in a state of compassion-focused meditation, scored a negative 0.45. He wasn't just happy. He was literally, and I mean literally, off their chart. The scientist had never seen anything even close to it. And just like that, Ricard became, scientifically speaking, the happiest man in the world. But this single startling data point, it wasn't just some fun fact. It was a declaration. It was suggesting that happiness was no longer just a fleeting feeling or some philosophical ideal or something poets write about. It was now a number. And that right there, that's the huge shift we're going to explore. This idea that happiness is something objective, something visible, and, this is the most important part, something improvable. What used to be the territory of poets and priests was now being claimed by neuroscientists, economists, and data analysts. And this wasn't just some academic thought experiment. Oh no. This new science was promising a kind of universal language, a way to quantify the human soul, and by doing that, a way to manage it. And this way of thinking has since rippled out from the lab and straight into the very centers of global power. And just look at where this idea lands. We're talking about places like the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland. I mean, this is where the billionaires, the CEOs, and the heads of state all get together to map out the future of global capitalism. And what's on the agenda? You guessed it, mindfulness, well-being. They're literally inviting monks like Mathieu Ricard to teach them how to gaze at their thoughts like a shepherd watching sheep. Now, this isn't some fringe wellness retreat. This is the command center of the entire global economy. The message is crystal clear. Our inner states, our happiness, they're not a private affair anymore. They're now seen as a crucial economic resource, a factor of production that has to be measured, monitored, and maximized for the health of the whole system. Right, but this massive shift didn't just happen overnight. Not at all. To really get how we ended up with brain scans at Davos, we have to jump in the time machine and go back. Way back, and meet the intellectual architects who first had the guts to place a ruler against the human soul. So who were these people? Who laid the groundwork for this really radical, almost audacious idea that our inner world of feeling could be perfectly mapped onto the outer world of cold, hard numbers? Well, the blueprint was really drawn up over about a century by three key thinkers. First up, in the 1780s, you have this English philosopher, Jeremy Bentham. He was this obsessive rationalist who believed that politics needed to be rebuilt on a really simple scientific foundation, the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain. His whole philosophy, utilitarianism, argued that a government's number one goal should be creating mass pleasure.
Then, fast forward to the 1850s, a German physicist named Gustav Fechner comes along and creates the very first mathematical link between a physical thing, like the weight of an object in your hand, and the subjective feeling it produces. He actually called this new field psychophysics. And finally, in the 1870s, an economist named William Stanley Jevons basically brought it all home. He argued that economic value itself is really just a measure of the pleasure and pain a product causes a consumer. And boom, there you have it, the entire intellectual foundation for the happiness industry. You know, let's just pause on Bentham's core idea for a second, because it is truly the bedrock of everything that comes after. Utilitarianism is a profoundly radical idea. It's saying that traditions, rights, morals, all that stuff is secondary. The only thing that really matters is the outcome, measured in these little units of pleasure and pain. To Bentham, every single person's happiness counted equally, and the goal of a rational government was to act like a giant, impartial calculator, just summing up all the pleasure and all the pain and picking the policy that gives you the highest net positive score. It's this vision of politics as a kind of scientific, technocratic management of how the public feels.
And to see just how far that Benthamite vision has come, you have to hear this quote from Lord Richard Layard. He's one of the most influential happiness economists out there today. When he says happiness is just like noise, what he means is that your individual story or my critique about what happiness is, it's all irrelevant. It's just static. The real signal, the truth of happiness, can only be found by crunching massive data sets, looking at survey results from millions of people and finding the statistical patterns. It is the ultimate expression of this belief that our collective well-being reveals itself not in dialogue, but in data.
Okay, so we have this intellectual blueprint, right? This belief that human feeling can and should be measured and managed. But how does an abstract idea like that actually get put into practice? Well, over the 20th century, it was applied with almost surgical precision to two of the most important arenas of modern life: the place where we work and the place where we shop. This is the story of how the worker's mind and the consumer's desires became these targets for scientific optimization. This slide here, it represents a huge, dramatic shift in how management thought about the worker. Back in the early 20th century, the big idea was Frederick Taylor's scientific management. Taylor was an engineer, and he basically saw the factory worker as just another part of the machinery, a body that needed to be fine-tuned for peak efficiency. But then, in the 1920s, a psychologist named Elton Mayo did these famous experiments at the Hawthorne Works factory, and what he found was incredible. He discovered that psychological factors, things like feeling valued or having a sense of team spirit, had a way bigger impact on productivity than physical conditions like the lighting. This was the birth of the human relations school of thought, and with it, this brand new idea that managing employee happiness was the real key to corporate profit. And that brings us right up to the modern corporate mantra, which is perfectly captured by the positive psychology promoter Sean Achor, who wrote this. For decades, I think we all assumed that if you're successful at work, then you'll be happy. But today, that whole equation has been flipped on its head. The argument now is that happy employees are the cause of success. They're more motivated, more resilient, more creative, more productive. So when you see companies investing in wellness programs and hiring chief happiness officers, they're not just being nice. They're making a very calculated investment in their own bottom line. Your well-being has literally become their business asset. So at the same time that managers were engineering the worker's mind, there was this whole parallel project going on to engineer the consumer's mind. It all started in the very first psychology labs in Germany, where pioneers like Wilhelm Wundt were trying to make the study of the mind a hard science. Those methods were then brought over to America by students like John B. Watson. Watson founded a school of thought called behaviorism, arguing that all that mattered was stimulus and response. And after he left academia, he took this big idea to Madison Avenue, where he created scientific advertising, an entire industry designed not just to inform us about products, but to scientifically condition our desires. Okay, so we've seen how this scientific measurement of feeling got applied to workers and to consumers. But this new science of happiness, it isn't just a set of techniques for corporations to use. It's also an incredibly powerful ideology. It comes with a whole new set of assumptions about how we should live our lives, what our problems really are, and who is responsible for solving them. And it's right here that the story, well, it takes a much darker and much more political turn. This chart, this is probably one of the most influential images in all of modern popular psychology. It comes from the work of a psychologist named Sonia Lubomirsky, and it's called the happiness pie. So what it claims is that 50% of our happiness is just determined by our genetic baseline. But look at the other half. Only 10%, just 10% of our happiness, according to this theory, is determined by our life circumstances. Now, this includes everything: your income, your health, the society you live in, all of it. The remaining 40%, she says, is down to our intentional activity, our choices, our attitude, our mindset. She calls this the 40% solution. And this is the critical question that the happiness pie really forces us to ask. I mean, if the concrete realities of our lives, our paychecks, the stability of our jobs, the fairness of our society, if all of that only accounts for a tiny little sliver of our well-being, what does that imply? Well, it implies that the real work isn't changing the world, it's changing ourselves. Structural problems like poverty or inequality get subtly reframed as individual problems of attitude and resilience. The burden of suffering gets placed squarely on the shoulders of the person who's suffering. And you can see this ideology playing out on a massive national scale. Back in 2016, the United Arab Emirates appointed the world's very first Minister of State for Happiness. Now, the UAE is a country with unbelievable wealth, but it also has really high levels of inequality and a pretty problematic human rights record. And yet, the minister's message, as you can see right here in this quote, is purely individualistic. Happiness is a choice. It's a masterful deflection, isn't it? Instead of addressing these deep-seated political and economic problems, the state just promotes an ideology of positive thinking, implicitly telling its citizens that their well-being is their own personal responsibility. So what this all leads to is a very powerful and frankly a deeply troubling message that comes out of the happiness industry. The message is this: if you are struggling, if you are unemployed or anxious or depressed, the problem isn't the economy. It isn't your company. It isn't politics. The problem is you. You just haven't cultivated the right mindset. You haven't chosen to see the glass as half full. Your personal failure gets completely recast as a failure of attitude. And this isn't just some harmless self-help platitude. It's a political logic that lets institutions off the hook and turns social critique inward against the self. So, where does all this leave us? We've traced this whole idea from Bentham's utilitarian calculus all the way to the modern wellness industry. We've seen how a science that promised to liberate us by making our feelings visible can actually end up creating new burdens and new forms of control. So, let's wrap this up by asking a really fundamental question. What is actually lost when we reduce the vast, complex, and often contradictory experience of being human down to a single, quantifiable metric we call happiness? Well, these are the hidden costs, the core arguments against this reductionist science. First, as we've seen, it turns social critique inward. Problems out there in the world become problems in our heads. Second, it masks real structural issues. A company offers mindfulness seminars instead of actually addressing a toxic culture of burnout. Third, it creates a brand new anxiety. This feeling that if we're not constantly flourishing or optimizing, we're somehow failing. Fourth, it silences other absolutely essential human emotions. Sadness and anger, they're not flaws to be fixed. They are often meaningful and, frankly, necessary human responses to the world. And finally, this whole enterprise just so happens to conveniently serve the interest of power, giving corporations more productive workers and governments more passive, compliant citizens. And so this is the final thought I really want to leave you with. The next time you see an article or an ad or a corporate program that's promising to increase your happiness, it's worth taking a beat and asking this question. Is this truly about my well-being, or is my well-being being used for some other purpose? Because when our emotions become data, when our minds become resources, the pursuit of happiness stops being just a personal journey. It becomes a political act. The question isn't whether we should want to be happy. Of course we should. The real question is, when we are told we must pursue happiness, whose happiness are we really, truly serving?